Good evening and welcome to our annual GWPF lecture. Before I introduce Lord Frost, I would like us to remember our founder, Lord Lawson, who very sadly passed away at the beginning of last month. And we wouldn't be here without him. And it was his bravery and his courage and inspiration to set this up, as well as do all the other wonderful things. Often, in his life, despite everybody else around him disagreeing with him. And that's what we need in public life more than ever, is proper challenge. And of course, the GWPF, for all it's being made out to be all sorts of things, is an educational charity which attempts to have a debate and to be a forum for that debate. And we welcome challenge and proper critical thinking on what are very important issues. And for those who don't know me, I'm Jerome Booth. I'm the chairman of the charity. Lord Frost almost needs no introduction at all, as he's so well known. Obviously, Lord Frost was an advisor, key advisor to Boris Johnson, and then became a cabinet minister and our chief negotiator for Brexit. And I'm delighted to introduce him today, and he's going to give our talk on not dark yet, but it's getting there. Lord Frost.
Well, thanks very much, Jerome. Can I begin by paying my tribute to Lord Lawson as well? I only met him a couple of times, and long after he'd ceased to be a cabinet minister. But in preparing this, I was looking out my old copy of his memoirs from the early 90s, and it's striking and in many ways, I guess, rather depressing illustration of how much politics has changed since his time in government, that memoir has no index entry for any of global warming, climate change, or even the word environment. Happy days. That changed obviously very soon after he stepped down. He got involved in the debate with gusto. He set up this foundation. He was also one of the few politicians who were willing to subject the consensus to real debate. And to the extent we are able to talk about these issues rationally is very much thanks to Lord Lawson's efforts, and he is very much missed by all of us. So it is a great honour to deliver the Foundation's annual lecture this evening, and I speak in the footsteps of very many distinguished predecessors and true experts. Steve Coonan last year, Richard Lindzen, Matt Ridley, and many, many more. And just mentioning those names shows why, before I became a trustee of the Foundation myself, I regarded these lectures as a beacon of rationality and reliable fact in a world which seems so devoid of them on this subject. So it is with trepidation, given this background, that I now put a foot into this debate myself. I am encouraged, though, by the fact that it's not only scientists and scientific experts who've delivered these lectures. There is a wider perspective, which we need to hear, and which, for example, Cardinal Pell, another sad loss this year, brought in his lecture as far back as 2011. The climate change issue can't be left just to scientists, because how it's handled affects the whole of society. And that's where I come in. I came into politics late, and through Brexit, not through climate. But 30 years dealing with the EU gives you a very good nose for bad economics, for lobbying, for rent-seeking, for la pensée unique, for corporatism, and indeed for a suspicion of capitalism and markets more broadly. All those things seem to me to be highly characteristic of the way we, by which I mean this government, but also governments across the West and our allies more broadly, characteristic of how we are handling the challenge of climate change. And that's why I care so much about this issue. I care about the risk that we're legislating ourselves into economic decline. It's therefore on that aspect, the economics, that I'm going to focus primarily tonight. And hence, of course, the title of my lecture, Not dark yet, but it's getting there. This is, of course, I'm sure you all know, a lyric from the great Bob Dylan track, although I admit to a heterodox view, which is that the recent Tom Jones version is actually better than the original. It's a song that's a reflection on his own mortality and his declining powers as a human being. But I think tonight we should make the same reflection about our society more broadly. It's not just about whether we literally go dark because we can't keep the lights on any longer, but it's also whether we in the West can sustain the confidence to face our challenges, to succeed as the world's leading economies and societies, or alternatively, whether we head into miserabilism, degrowth, and economic decline. So tonight, I'm going to speak mainly about how we're handling the consequences of the scientific view of climate, rather than whether that scientific view is well-founded in the first place. However, every speaker on this subject does have to make their view clear, if only as inoculation against some of the wilder accusations that inevitably come your way. So it seems to me that the physics of the greenhouse effect is extremely well established. The ability to predict what that means for the climate way out into the future is less so, but it does seem overwhelmingly likely that there's been human agency in the global temperature rises of the last century or more. That said, as Steve Koonin, distinguished physicist, Undersecretary for Science in the Obama administration, who I already mentioned, notes in his book Unsettled, and I quote, "The science is insufficient to make useful projections about how the climate will change over the coming decades, much less what effect our actions will have on it," end quote. He later describes, quote, "over-the-top statements about the climate emergency and the climate crisis as, quote, increasingly divorced from the science," a view which seems very reasonable to me. Overall, I take it as a desirable goal to reduce the amount of carbon we emit, but in a way which is proportionate to the threat, if threat there is, and in a way which sustains economic prosperity and growth. Climate change, in my view, is a problem, one of the many we face. It is not existential, and it doesn't mean extinction is coming. That science is, in my view, distinct from the political goal of net zero 2050. That is an arbitrary target, conceived to meet another arbitrary target, to keep temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. The causal connection between all those things is very much open to debate. So are the necessary trade-offs. So is the methodology by which we approach that target. And I refuse to accept that questioning the specific target of net zero 2050 can be or should be off limits for discussion. Indeed, only propositions which subject themselves to debate are worthy of being taken seriously in the first place. So we have to keep asking, is net zero 2050 an achievable goal at an acceptable cost? And are we going about it in the right way? Well, my answer, perhaps not entirely surprisingly, is no. I'm going to argue that the route we have chosen to deliver net zero is inevitably wasteful and damaging, that it's totally implausible, as some say, that it will boost growth, and much more likely that it's going to reduce it, that as a result of all this, governments are pursuing completely incompatible political and economic objectives, but they won't be able to do that forever. When the crunch comes, they may well double down on more economically damaging measures to reach the goal. And therefore, finally, the people like me, people like many, I guess, in this audience, need to prepare for the moment when that crunch comes, when we need to try and get onto a more rational path with a rethink of net zero methods and almost certainly the timetable. So, first of all, much as net zero policy is obviously about how we predict the future, and that is difficult, as we have seen from the OBR's and the IMF's efforts over the last year. Even short-run predictions within well-understood economies are subject to huge and damaging errors. Yet the uncertainties we face on net zero go massively beyond this. A huge number of factors are at play. not just the inherent unpredictability of any modern economy, but uncertainty about technologies, hydrogen, SMRs, CCS, much more, the effect of decisions made by the government, by regulators, their interaction domestically and internationally, the impact of all the different mixes of electricity generation, the effect of renewables on the grid, much, much more. And on top of all that, massive international uncertainty and extremely dangerous geopolitics. That means that predictions now are almost certainly going to be wrong. In fact, one can test this by looking backwards and checking predictions that have actually been made, which is something that policymakers all too rarely do. Look at the predictions made in the Labour government's 2003 Energy White Paper, 20 years ago this year. Actually, this is quite a sober document and in many ways more economically rational than more recent outputs from the government. I'll come on to them. The political environment was, I guess, relatively calmer than now. Still, they got a lot wrong. They obviously did not foresee shale gas and the dramatic upending of assumptions about future prices that came with it. They envisaged much more extensive wave and tidal power. They thought there would be much more local generation from them, but also biomass and waste. They thought there would be much more backup capacity for renewables intermittency, and they thought that nuclear power would be well on the way out, in fact almost disappeared. And as a result of those judgments, they took us down a route that we can now see today was an extremely problematic road, and we're dealing with the consequences. Now, governments nowadays are going to have exactly the same difficulties in making reliable predictions for the same reasons. It is, of course, well known since Hayek that knowledge about an economy is dispersed and cannot even in principle, be known by planners. The inherent uncertainties in the current situation mean that today's confident predictions about energy prices, technologies, their economic and scientific effect, and their interaction with the climate are little more than just guesswork. You might think, therefore, that the right thing for governments to do would be to invest in basic scientific research and experimentation, to establish a simple regime for taxing the externality of carbon emissions at whatever level was felt to be right, to put in place a supportive regime for planning and infrastructure, and otherwise stand back and let the market sort out how best to meet that policy goal, however it was defined and however demanding it was. Now, of course, governments have done no such thing. They have all, without exception, I think, chosen a highly dirigiste route to net zero. Despite all the evidence, all the Western governments believe they know best. They're confident in the technologies that will get us to the goal. So we've got targets for almost everything: cars, boilers, hydrogen, offshore wind, solar, and so on. They've delivered highly complex policy regimes to take us there, which assume they're capable of calibrating exactly correctly the right amount of tax and subsidy to make it happen. As a result, they've created systems which are so complex that I don't think anybody can actually understand how they work. There's nothing like a free market, yet there's no clear government direction or centralization either. The consequences of this system, it being unpredictable, are themselves unpredictable, and the unwelcome consequences themselves have to be corrected for in a familiar cycle, as we see at the moment, for example, with the proposed hydrogen levy. Now, Dieter Helm, I'll quote him on a few occasions. He wrote of the UK energy market in his 2017 energy review, and I quote, "The sheer number of interventions in the UK energy market is so great that few, if any, participants in the markets, few regulators, ministers or civil servants can have grasped them all. The inability of the market participants to grasp all these interventions is in itself likely to increase the cost of energy. The result is it's not possible to make a cost-effectiveness assessment of any of the specific policies." And I dare say nothing has changed much since 2017. Now, this has happened for the same reason it always happens. It's because governments are generally made up of clever people, and clever people tend to think they know best about how to go about things. This is true generally in government. Look at the calls from all sides at the moment, all sides of the political spectrum, for a new industrial strategy. But it is perhaps particularly true in this specific area of energy and climate, which is full of highly educated people who believe that their narrow specialisms, often painfully achieved, qualify them to predict the future accurately, and certainly often make them disdainful of people who question them. Now, we can be confident of one thing in assessing this dirigiste approach, that it will be highly economically inefficient. We can be sure that regulators will be captured, rents will be sought, and poor decisions will not only be taken, but will be persisted with long after it is clear that they are actually irrational. Moreover, we're investing in technologies which are certainly less efficient at producing energy than their predecessors and less reliable in delivering it when it's needed. We're hoping that something will turn up to help out, and at the same time we're imposing or promising restrictions on lifestyles to deal with the consequences. We all know the examples. In Britain, we'll soon be making people buy inferior and more expensive boiler technology and driving people out of the new car market if they aren't prepared to take a punt on electric vehicles. House designs, take another example, are increasingly constrained, and indeed energy efficiency requirements, actual and future, are squeezing the whole housing market. Most egregiously, in my view, we are forcing investment in windmills, a technological breakthrough when first mentioned when Henry II was on the throne, but less obviously suited to providing power on demand today. We've found no solution to the intermittency problem other than a backup network of gas and coal-fired power stations. The battery storage technology does not exist. Hydro storage can't be developed in anything the right scale, and hydrogen remains costly and so far unproven. Moreover, it's surely obvious that renewables plus backup will be more expensive than just the backup. Despite all these problems, many seem to believe that the solution to many of our problems is just to keep building windmills until we have, quote, enough. Now, in normal circumstances, one might expect political parties advocating this sort of rather grim vision of legal compulsion to adopt defective technology to be rapidly chucked out of office and replaced by those backing economic growth and higher living standards. Now, that obviously is not happening. That's partly, I think, because the intellectual climate has got highly collectivist. As we discovered from the Liz Truss government, there seems little real understanding of how a modern economy or a free market actually functions, and indeed it turned out that many did not understand the concept of growth as such during that autumn. Hardly anybody thinks that desirable outcomes can be achieved by the market, and almost everybody seems to think that if the government is not doing something, then it isn't happening. The normal tendency that all intellectuals have to fail to understand economics has been reinforced in Europe anyway by the widespread belief that the purpose of policy making is to tame markets, not to liberate them, and by the view that the 2008 crash and subsequent bailouts was caused by free market capitalism rather than by bad regulation and poor central bank decision making. There's been a general drift leftwards, and of course the left, including that substantial proportion of the left which still thinks it's on the right, they always like control and direction. An instinct which explains why they liked lockdown so much and which they find conveniently reinforced in net zero. Now, there is another reason, I think, though, why normal political mechanisms aren't working. And it's that governments are now claiming, seemingly with a straight face, that net zero policies are actually good for the economy. And that's actually a relatively recent development. Let me refer again to the 2003 Energy White Paper. This suggested that dealing with climate change, and of course at that point we still had a much less demanding target of a 60% reduction in carbon by 2050, that white paper said that solving the problem would cost up to 2% of GDP. That may have been an implausibly low figure. I think it is an implausibly low figure, but it is at least a cost. But by this year, 20 years later, in its March response to the Skidmore Energy Review, we find the government saying, I quote, net zero is the growth opportunity of the 21st century and could offer major economic opportunities to the UK. The Skidmore Review itself said, and I quote, in some estimates, the UK would see approximately 2% additional growth in GDP, that's by 2050, through the benefits from new jobs, increased economic activity, reduced fossil fuel imports and cost savings, for example, cheaper household bills. I'm sure we've all noticed those. That 2% figure, when you dig into it, goes back to just one rather thin study, dating from 2020 by a firm called Cambridge Econometrics, which claims extra growth of actually 2 to 3% by 2050 if the sixth carbon budget and its successors are fully implemented. Of course, they're not being. It's hardly comprehensive or robust. In truth, in my view, this whole area is riddled with economic fallacies. Not just the Cambridge Econometrics report, and it's a bit unfair to pick on it, but report after report, commentary after commentary makes the same mistakes. And we'll just single out a few of these. We see repeatedly Bastiat's famous broken windows fallacy, as he set out in his great essay Ce qu'on voit et ce qu'on ne voit pas, what is seen and what is unseen. The view that capital destruction is actually good for the economy because of all the work you generate in repairing it. Rather than seeing that such activity does not increase the net stock of wealth and doesn't take into account the opportunity cost, that is, how the resources could have been used on something more productive. In our case, much net zero investment simply replaces existing capital. It doesn't improve it. And indeed, arguably, what we're left with is worse than what we have now, leaving us with an energy sector that's less productive and less useful than the one we had at the start. How is that going to make us a more productive economy? Second, we see the persistent temptation to count benefits but not the costs. The Cambridge Econometrics report explicitly says that its modelling is based on the assumption that taxes will go up to fund the extra public investment required, which they claim is only 1% of GDP, though it's almost certainly a lot more. Isn't that increase in taxes going to affect growth? Won't the rickety renewable heavy grid or investment by private firms in the generators they'll need to secure security of supply, the general effect on the business environment, isn't that going to affect growth as well? Similarly, we see optimism bias. As Dieter Helm again wrote last month, is not, I quote, is not good enough just to assume that the costs for all the good stuff will just follow a sharp line downwards, while fossil fuel prices will remain volatile and ever higher. This optimism bias is a particular feature of judgments about the direct costs of the transition to net zero, as opposed to the economic effect. Again, the Cambridge report says this will be 1% of GDP annually. Skidmore says 1 to 2% of GDP. But independent studies produced by this foundation, but quite a lot of others, suggest it may well be about 3 times that, if not higher, well above any conceivable cost of adaptation to increasing temperatures. We see illusory certainty and misplaced confidence in prediction. And part of the justification, as I said, for that Cambridge extra growth figure is the belief, they actually say it, that they're confident that electricity prices will be lower by 2050 because of all the renewables we'll have installed by then. Well, good luck with that. Of course, one could express that growth figure alternatively as additional growth of 0.06%, or maybe up to 0.1%, in each of the 30 years from 2020. That is essentially a rounding error, obviously, and no one can make predictions of such precision, and I say that such a prediction is not meaningful in any way. Similarly, we see the view that resources are always available for whatever you want to do. Again, the Cambridge report bases its growth figure partly on an assumption that there are lots of unemployed resources sitting around which can be mobilised by public investment in a Keynesian sort of way. In this world, there's lots of capital waiting to be used. We always have enough workers. There are no timing complexities or linkages that must be properly sequenced. Foreigners are always willing to fund the UK, and UK consumers are always happy to do the necessary saving instead of consuming. Massive projects like insulating every home in the UK or doubling the capacity of the electricity grid seem to be capable of being undertaken in this world without any resource constraints or any effects in the wider economy. Obviously, that's not a realistic depiction of the world we live in. And finally, we see all the general fallacies that are always associated with industrial policy-like activity. The view that individual businesses' prospects are the same thing as the economy's prospects. That certain kinds of industries have accurately predictable spin-off effects on the wider economy and are therefore worth supporting with lots of public money. The view that the overall prosperity of the country can be increased by pumping public money into industries in depressed parts of the UK. The view that successful technologies can be reliably predicted ex ante. Or, perhaps the most widely cited of all, that the large numbers of jobs created in green industries are a benefit to the economy rather than what they are, a cost of investing in technology that is less good than its predecessors. It seems to me really quite implausible, given this long list of fallacies and economic solecisms, that the current net zero programme is going to boost growth. Quite the opposite. I think we can be confident that much of this investment will turn out to be wasted. To the extent it is not, as I've said, it will deliver us a system of energy production, distribution and consumption which is higher cost, lower output, less robust and efficient, and indeed is already beginning to do so. This is going to have effects that are entirely predictable and indeed already visible. We've already seen the supply disruption in parts of the West, notably parts of the US, as strains on the grid grow. In Britain, we're seeing lower productivity across the economy. We're seeing disinvestment in relatively energy-intensive industries. We are seeing big subsidies to try and get these industries back here. That's exactly what you would expect to see. It's for the net zero proponents, in my view, it's for them to prove, not just say, to prove that all these basic principles of economics will be different in future, and I don't think they can do that. Now, it is important not to overstate this and become catastrophists like some net zero advocates themselves. The net zero plans are a significant drag anchor on the economy. They're not a crisis yet. Market economies are actually very highly flexible things, as we've learned in recent years. Europe responded much better to last year's energy crisis than many thought possible, though we did get lucky with a relatively warm winter. Even the much more extreme cases we've seen in recent years, the sanctions against Qatar a few years ago, sanctions against Russia last year, have in fact, after a period of adjustment, had remarkably little effect on the economies concerned, more's the pity. The South African economy too copes somehow with a seriously problematic energy sector. But as that last example shows, the drag anchor does really matter. It does make a difference. It matters especially if only certain countries, that is Western countries, are imposing it on themselves, and especially if the foreseeable measures seem likely to get tougher and not softer. Now, I actually sense our own government is beginning to realise that the economics are a bit more doubtful than the net zero proponents argue. If, as Fraser Nelson and other commentators say, our Prime Minister is beginning to get worried by the costs of net zero, well, we can only welcome that. There is evidently some debate now within government on the balance between security of supply, price, decarbonisation, and so on. And as the Climate Change Committee repeatedly tells us, UK government policy is already not consistent with the declared policy of decarbonising the electricity grid by 2035. And again, I quote Dieter Helm for the last time, where he comments, I quote, "There's very little chance that that 2035 target will be met, and no chance on current policies. So we must welcome the government's seeming willingness to push gently against the net zero ideology. For example, with the proposed Cumbrian coal mine, the opening up of new areas in the North Sea, the renewed push behind nuclear. Though, of course, in all these areas, wider policy, for example, on taxing the energy sector, has to be made properly consistent with that too. We can also see this beginning of second thoughts, perhaps, in the incipient questioning of net zero measures across Europe. The EU, as we've seen, is getting cold feet about abolishing the internal combustion engine. Who knows how we are to interpret President Macron's comments last week about green regulation, but it's certainly a good sign, I think, that these sort of things are being said. Here in the UK, the politics of heat pumps and electrification of vehicles are beginning to make themselves felt. Ipsos Mori polling from last autumn shows that support for most specific net zero measures is actually falling. The most strongly supported specific measures, not surprisingly, are those which most people probably believe would not affect them personally. Changes in pension fund investment rules, long-haul frequent flyer levies and so on. But support for phasing out gas boilers has halved, and support for EV subsidies is now only slightly positive. Yet, there remains a long way to go. The atmosphere of groupthink is extremely strong. Public opinion still leans heavily one way on the principles, with huge majorities in favour in principle of net zero. And it's easily maintained like that because of the unfortunate practical limitations on free debate on this subject. The net zero opinion is still a high status opinion. The crunch point's a long way off. And no doubt many people also think something like, all these clever people can't be totally wrong. Many, even on the right of British politics, supposed advocates of free markets and economic rationality, seem reluctant to think hard about net zero. And what worries me is there seems to be something approaching an active determination across politicians and across opinion formers not to look too closely at these issues. And that worries me. As the great Alfred Sherman said back in the 70s, and I quote, "You can wake a man who's asleep, but you can't wake a man who's pretending to be asleep." So in fact, my sense at the moment is that Western governments, for now, actively prefer to live in complete cognitive dissonance rather than confront what they know in their hearts, which is that they are pursuing unfeasible and internally contradictory policies. To summarise the situation, governments are pushing a set of economic policies which they say are essential to save the planet. Yet even so, those policies are not consistent with the declared goal, and they're not tough enough to achieve it. Nevertheless, even as they are being implemented, those policies foreseeably make the economy worse. Nevertheless, governments tell their voters that these policies are good for them. Nevertheless, they impose them by compulsion rather than allowing free choice about them. And finally, they sustain and support a political debate in which it is very difficult for anyone, including the governments themselves, to explore alternatives. I don't think this can be sustained indefinitely. Unless we're all rescued by some unforeseen technological development, something at some point is going to crack. There seem to me to be two possible directions of travel. The first possibility is that resistance to net zero measures continues to grow, and eventually governments respond to that by abandoning, or I think more likely delaying, the goal, or at least by going about it in an economically more rational way, as I set out earlier, even though, of course, that will make the costs even more visible and obvious in the short run. I think this could happen as doubts about the nature of the climate crisis begin to grow, and as voters in the West get frustrated by the persistent slow growth and increasing restrictions on their lifestyles and economic activity, while the rest of the world seems to carry on as normal. The Dutch Farmers' Party's success could be a straw in the wind here of how the debate is going. But still, to make any real impact, mainstream political parties here and across Europe need to pick up the issue. And it will require a persistent minority to push hard to change the debate. Now, that's not impossible. We did see it here in the US and a few other places on lockdown policy during the pandemic, where a seemingly dominant paradigm was overturned almost overnight when people woke up to it. Still, at the moment, I think the political conditions are quite a long way from enabling that to happen. So the second possibility, I think, is one in which governments recognise they can no longer credibly sustain the economic justification for their measures. But the wider politics, the reluctance to admit error, mean they cannot bring themselves to abandon the target and, in fact, make further efforts to try and reach it. And at that point, we should expect to see a ramping up of the rhetoric around catastrophic risk in order to justify much tougher measures. The diversion of perhaps 5% of GDP annually, maybe more, to these efforts, together with assertive measures to control consumption and demand. Now, my worry is that the broader climate at the moment of economic and political debate tends to lead things in this direction. The huge focus we see on lifestyle change to save the planet, the politicization of everyday lifestyle choices. I see that gardening, I see, as the latest one, where how you maintain your garden shows your view of the world. The emphasis on living local, the emphasis on sustainability rather than being a burden on the earth, and the general focus on reducing energy consumption for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, rather than seeing cheap and abundant energy for what it is, a necessity to improve human lives. Now, I think all this prepares the ground for measures that could get worse. And I think policy during the pandemic, I did just quote it, but it did show how difficult it is for most governments to escape the climate of opinion they created, to admit to errors and to change course. And all this, in my view, is seriously alarming. If we don't restrict, if we don't resist this miserablest approach now, this approach that ends with lifestyle restrictions and probably rationing, we will risk seriously damaging levels of economic irrationality in the next decade. That outcome would risk us not just going dark through power supply shortages, but could set the West seriously on the back foot in the geopolitical competition of the coming years. So I think a crunch is coming, and I think the job of those who are willing to debate this issue, to question it, to ask for discussion of it, is to see this moment coming and start to get the politics ready for it. We must show that pushing for net zero on the current timetable and with current methods will involve unacceptable costs to the economy and to individuals. We must persistently question the view that voters must just live with those costs and adjust their lifestyles as a result. That doesn't have to involve claiming that net zero or something close to it is an undesirable goal. Carbon reduction is worth doing, but it does involve explaining that we've chosen a method which ensures vast waste, inefficiency, cronyism and economic decline, the costs of which will be borne by the average voter. So we need a rethink of the methods and almost certainly of the timetable. Finally, we must do this in ways which can be easily communicated and which resonate with public opinion. And to finish up, I've got a few suggestions on that. First of all, I think we need to keep underlining that there is not just a problem, there is a solution. That solution, as we know, is gas to nuclear, backed with investment in fundamental research and taking advantage of any technological advances that come our way. To do that doesn't require us to massively invest in new energy production of doubtful value. The government can stop guessing about future winners and support investment in technologies which exist now and offer the best, fastest and most reliable way of getting carbon emissions down quickly. Second, I think we will need to be more publicly dismissive of current renewable technologies as an unnecessary complication to net zero. We need to find a much clearer way of explaining why renewables, particularly windmills, though not only them, why they're inherently more expensive than the other options, and communicating the obvious point that if you need renewables plus backup, why not just have the backup and avoid all the other problems? Third, we must keep underlining the direct costs to the average voter. The mounting totals of renewables subsidies, both on bills and in tax, the extra costs to them of installing less good quality boilers, electric cars, the impact of compulsory insulation and energy efficiency, and much, much more. We need to put figures on those things and stick to them and start talking about them. We can point out that even doing all this, we're off track to deliver net zero on the government's timetable. All this pain that you're suffering is not even getting us towards the goal. Fourth, we can point out who is benefiting. We're in a populist mood, so we probably have to be a bit populist. Point to the wealthy who can afford all the dubious carbon offset schemes and carry on as before, the green energy companies that are just raking off taxpayer subsidies, and much, much more. These are the people who are getting the benefits. Meanwhile, small businesses that are producing useful products in a competitive economy are being crushed by the burdens of all of this. Fifth, I think we should point to lockdown. In 2020, the banning of most human contact and travel for a large part of the year resulted in a fall in UK emissions of just 9%. Imagine what it would take to get that figure down much further. The people were prepared to live with very much tougher restrictions on their life forever for these goals. And finally, I think we need to be positive. We've allowed the net zero advocates to become associated with positivity, with a clean, green future, when in fact what they're offering is a future of rationing, of restrictions, and of miserablism. We need to keep underlining that it's we who believe in the future. We believe in technology. We who have a solution for the problem of cost-effective energy at scale. It is we who believe that human ingenuity can solve this issue in a way that makes us all better off. So to conclude, we aren't dark yet, but we do risk getting there. At the moment, we're heading in the wrong direction. We're hamstringing ourselves, we're making our people poorer, we are reducing opportunity, and as a result, we're limiting our economic, political, foreign policy capacity, our ability to get what we want in the world and make ourselves richer. But at the same time, there are the first signs of consumer resistance to the practical consequences of net zero ideology. The crunch is coming. We must do everything we can to change the debate and be ready for the moment when we can hope to push things in a different direction. It's no exaggeration to say that the future of our societies rests on it. Thank you very much.